All right, so a formal welcome. I'm Krista, a highly sensitive human, and I work as a writer, grief and trauma-informed mind-body coach, and joyful living educator. My work centers around the needs and experiences of midlife women. Happy to be here with you again. We are recording live in the sensitive empowerment community, a welcoming space for sensitive people and many other neurodivergent folks. You can learn more and join us at sensitivecommunity.com. So today's topic is grieving the loss of a parent. I do not want to kind of repeat what I've already shared previously. Episode 180 of Julie's HSP podcast, I shares a presentation entitled Thriving Through and Beyond Grief as HSPs. So you might want to check that out as well. Yeah, okay. So grief is healthy and messy. We can't avoid the messy part. We can't avoid the messiness of life or of grief and death. So our grief experience when a parent dies varies wildly, of course, and is influenced by so many factors, including, not limited to, the relationship that we had with that parent, our culture, our core beliefs, our personality, previous experiences, the level of our current coping skills, level of social support that we have, what else is happening in our body or life at the time of the death, and more. That last point, what else is happening in our body or life at the time of death? When we lose a parent, what is often true is that life is happening all around us, and we might be juggling work and kids and a health issue and whatever else is happening. And so we often have a lot of stressors in our life, a lot of pressures, and there are a lot of demands on our lives. And that can make our experience even trickier. And I think we'll say a little bit more about that later, or I will. So, so grief is messy, and there is no one right way to do anything in life, but it can be helpful to normalize experiences, whether we're talking about normalizing certain parenting experiences, if we have young adults, or, whatever we're talking about, right? Just remembering that, okay, I'm not alone. I'm not doing this wrong. There are other people having similar experiences. I definitely find that helpful. And so just to get us started, I want to share a bit of information that is definitely applicable to any type of grief that we're talking about. And I'm hoping that as we frame this conversation through the lens of death of a parent, that you can use this information and kind of look at your personal experience or what you might be navigating or preparing for right now, and kind of use these steps or this information to help kind of provide some guidance for you, or comfort or encouragement. So the first thing I'd like to share is these 4 tasks of mourning by psychotherapist and grief researcher William Worden. So these 4 tasks are not linear. We might be working on multiple tasks at once. We might feel like there's a sense of completion, so to speak, for a period of time, and then we come on back and we do some deeper work. I like to think often in life and in my work about going deeper, not wider. So sometimes we feel discouragement when we're like, haven't I done this already? Why am I back here? Why is this hard again? And we might have a lot of internal judgment or chatter or worry. And when we're talking about grief, there can be a lot of fear and anxiety also, because it can be, there's some intensity around that, and it's not comfortable. So it's normal. I think it's really helpful to know that there really isn't a linear process, but there are some commonalities that we can look for. So task 1 is to accept the reality of the loss intellectually and emotionally. This task, to accept the reality of the loss, we might start doing this work if we know that our parent is dying. So if we have forewarning, maybe they have dementia, maybe they have cancer, but that, we might be able to start doing some of this kind of grappling work. And it could take a really long time, again, depending on the nature of the death, and the type of relationship, etc. This could go on for a long time. Task 2 is to process the pain of grief, and that includes being able to name our emotions, be with them little by little, and then process them in healthy ways. And we will talk more about this. And one thing that I just will say here is that we can't do this all at once. There is sort of this protective mechanism in us, which is really good to help us not get overwhelmed, even though we might feel overwhelmed often. But there is this protective nature where we do some of this intense processing feeling work, and then we might get a bit of relief, and then we'll do more, and then a little bit of relief. And it's really important that we allow ourselves the relief. So even if that's you let yourself just, Netflix and tune out for a while, or you let yourself just be happy for a while. You know what I mean? It's anyway, it's a big conversation, but those times of relief are just as important and necessary as the times where we learn how to be with the feelings. Task number 3 is to adjust to a world without our loved one. And there are 3 ways that we can explore this. One is looking internally. So how has the loss of this parent affected my day-to-day, or no, sorry, that would be more external. More, how has it affected my sense of self? External, how has their death affected my everyday life? And then there's a spiritual component. And if you're not a spiritual person per se, this is still more about your core beliefs, your sense of safety, your sense of place in the world. So how has their death affected my spiritual beliefs or views of the world, or my sense of safety in the world? So for instance, when my mom died, I was 31, she was 53. She was also my best friend in that season of life. And I've heard other people express that, and she was my safe person. And so when she died, it felt like the world shifted on its axis and I couldn't find my footing, and I started having panic attacks. And so that's just one personal example. Task number 4 is to find an enduring connection with that person as we also keep living and thriving forward. And we'll talk more about that later as well. Okay, so that's one way of approaching this, is these 4 tasks of mourning. Another thing that I want to offer you are 6 needs of a grieving person. And this comes from grief educator and author David Kessler. And I'm going to even though they don't do this, I'm going to weave them together. So the first 4 of the 6 needs that I'm going to share with you, I would put these into task number 2, to process the pain of grief. So the first 4 needs of a grieving person, as David Kessler shares, to have our pain witnessed, to have others come and sit with us in our pain without fixing. Number 2, to express our feelings and use our voice. So we might have all sorts of unexpected feelings. No feeling is bad or wrong. We can't feel everything at once, as I shared, but we do need to find our way to being able to feel, process, and release, or what I prefer is more like allow those feelings to kind of shift. So they might ebb and flow, come and go. And part of this is understanding and just acknowledging without shame or judgment that it can feel really scary to feel this intensely. Number 3, to release the burden of guilt. It's often more comfortable to feel guilty than helpless. Some would say that we would always rather feel guilty than helpless. And some of this is like the feelings that we might have, including guilt, can be about wishing that we could control the outcome, wanting to be able to go back. And of course, that isn't possible. And this can move into the territory of accepting the reality of the loss as well, where the story's done, we can't go back and change it. What do we do with all of these feelings that we're having? The number 6 of the 6 needs of a grieving person, number 4, which is still part of processing the pain of grief, is to address the old wounds that arise during the grieving process. And I touched on this in episode 180 of Julie's podcast. And so I won't go too far into this, but what happens is we tend to project old wounds onto current situations. So let's say, again, I'm just picking an example out of a hat because each of us could have wildly different experiences. But one example that comes to mind is if you had a history or a wound of rejection, and this parent is dying, and you are looking for affirmation from them that maybe you never received, or maybe they're just doing their best coping with their own process of dying, that old wound may come to the surface and it can intensify or almost color whatever is happening. So I think I have created a place where I can say a little bit more about this, but I do think this is one of the important things to know that not a lot of people know, is that often in grief, our old wounds will rise to the surface, maybe not immediately, but in the 1, 2, 3 years following, maybe even later. And it is an opportunity to just notice what's coming up and bring compassion and get the resourcing that we need to heal / attend to that old wound. All right, so the 5th need is to integrate the pain and the love. And integration feels like a million little acceptances rather than a one-time choice. And this, I believe, fits into tasks 1 and 3 that I mentioned earlier. So it's partly like accepting the reality of the loss, and it can also be about adjusting to the world without that person in our life anymore, little by little. And finally, the sixth need of a grieving person, to find meaning in time. And I hope to have time to address this a little bit more, because I think this can be tricky. And if you're in early grief, I would avoid, like if I was working with somebody in that stage, I wouldn't bring up this because it feels almost hurtful or offensive. Like, I'm in the middle of pain and you're telling me I'm supposed to find meaning in this. It's like not helpful. And really, this is not at all about finding meaning in the tragedy or loss itself. It's about figuring out, how do I keep living? And I have some examples for you that I will, bring in later. But I would put this in the fourth task, which is to find an enduring connection with the person that died as we continue building a life. So again, there's no perfect timeline, and we're not looking for that. We don't want to try to squish your big, beautiful experience into a little box, right? And also it can be helpful, again, to sort of normalize or to have a sense of what you might be able to expect, even if your experience doesn't fit neat and tidy, right? So there is this, so I'll give you some things that you could look for in terms of timeline. So anticipatory grief. So these are actually 4 stages of grief. So there's anticipatory grief, and we experience that when, again, maybe we have a parent that we know they are dying, right? So whether we have 2 weeks to deal with that reality, or 2 years or 9 years, we might be experiencing what's called anticipatory grief. Acute grief happens in the first days, weeks, or months following the death. Early grief is considered about the first 2 years. And as I shared in that previous presentation, episode 180, if there was traumatic loss, this might be more like the first 3 years. And yeah, and then mature grief is basically the rest of your life. So for the rest of this time with you, I'm going to frame my conversation or divide it into a few sections. So anticipatory grief, acute grief, and then I'm going to combine early grief and mature grief. And my intention is to simply share about some of the possible experiences you might have and ideas for caring for yourself well during this time. And then, of course, what I think would be the most helpful is the discussion time after, because that's where we can talk about your specific stories, needs, and examples. So anticipatory grief, again, that's grief before the death or during the process of dying. This can be a physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually taxing time, depending, again, on all the different factors, and how long it lasts. So a handful of points that I decided felt important to share today. The first is one that we'll see how you feel about this, but this is my take on it, that the dying process is about them, not you. You're having your own experience, and it's valid and important, but it's also separate from their process. There are many reasons why I feel like being able to feel even energetically the separation, or to try to imagine or visualize it, can be really helpful for us. But ultimately, I believe that the person who is dying, if they have a voice, if they have that capacity, they get to be in control, even if you wish they would make different decisions. So those different decisions could be about pain control, openness about the dying process, communicating about their desires for after their death or whatever. I think it's appropriate to follow their lead and honor their choices wherever possible. And so that's like over there, you're sort of, this is their story, and you are a witness to their story. But over here, you are in your own story, and you're having all your own wants, needs, hopes, longings, fears, emotional experience. And this also needs to be attended to, but it may not be able to be resolved by the person who is dying, right? So I will point you towards a book that is a pretty new book. I really appreciated it. And you may, if you're interested, you could check it out. It's by death doula, American death doula Alua Arthur. It's entitled Briefly, Perfectly Human, Making an Authentic Life by Getting Real About the End. And I believe, I read it recently and I just can't remember 100%, but in there, I believe she kind of touches on that idea. Anyways, I enjoyed it, appreciated it. So, but it's something that, my mom died 22 years ago. My dad died 11 years ago. Most of my friends haven't lost their parents. One just lost her mom, but I do work with clients navigating different types of grief. And so it's just something that I've been pondering, observing, and it's something that, I just offer up to you to consider. But I believe, again, the dying process is about them, your parent, and they get to be in charge of that, even if you would make different decisions or your needs are not getting met by their choices. So this is a time for really healthy boundaries of all sorts. Emotional boundaries, time boundaries, physical, financial, all the things. If your boundary skills aren't super strong, you might want to access some resources to help you focus and identify where do you have leaky boundaries? Where are you feeling pressured or swayed by other people's perceptions or expectations? What is it, above all, what is it that you need to stay steady and healthy during this time? So, some of the things that we could think about would be, like if you're, do you want, again, like these may not relate to you, but I'm just pulling examples from people I know and have worked with. So your mom is dying, and do you want her, can she move in with you, or does she move into hospice? What do you have capacity for? Your parent needs a lot of support, including rides to medical appointments and so on. What do you have to give? What is your capacity? And are there other people that could also step up? So sometimes we have these feelings of obligation or guilt, and that's not necessarily a good reason to give more than we truly have capacity for, right? Because one of the things that I know is that if we crumble, then we can't continue to show up for that person in the ways that we would truly like. Also, we have a right to protect ourselves. We have a right to stay healthy. If your parent is dying, you chances are you also have other responsibilities and people that you love that also need you, So it can be this really tricky time of figuring out who gets my energy and my resources, and how do I stay, healthy and whole while all of this is happening. Interestingly, this is something that came up from work with a client, and it may or may not be appropriate or relevant in every situation, but I thought it was a really interesting thing to consider. I'll pose it as a question for you, but could you support the person you love who is dying by kind of calling on or using your deepest gifting? So instead of feeling like you need to be the person who does all the things, clean the house, hire the caregivers, go through the paperwork, do all the driving, all the things, what is that thing that you could offer that is really rooted into your place of deepest gifting. So now it doesn't mean it's always neat and tidy like this, but so for instance, if you are somebody that you love taking your parent out to the market and to the theater, you know, providing that this is something that brings them joy. Or maybe you and that parent connect over sports or whatever. Could you allow yourself to put more energy into serving from that place more than doing the things that you really dislike? Like maybe you hate cooking meals. Maybe there are other people that could cook the meals and you could take your parent out as long as they're wanting to and capable of doing so, go out to do the things that bring them joy, you know? Or maybe you're somebody who is wonderful at rubbing lotion on your mom's legs and feet and painting her nails. And you're less good at other tasks, you know? It's like you don't have to be the whole world. And would it be okay if you allowed yourself to love and show up from that place of just you being your true self? Processing pain might begin now. So often there is an element of processing that does start naturally in this phase of anticipatory grief. I would not want you to believe, though, and you may have experience with this, but what I don't think is true is that you can just plan for it. Like it's like no amount of processing now will eliminate the work that might need to happen after. It doesn't quite work that way. But attending to your emotional experience is really important. You might be able to do that through talking with friends, journaling. There are some good workbooks that can provide some guidance. And one example, and I'm hoping to provide just a few resources for you in the HSP community that you can check out. One of them is called the Grief Recovery Handbook. It's very action-oriented, not like an academic thing. And one of my good friends who recently lost her mom, she and a colleague went through that workbook together. And she found, as her mom was dying of dementia, and she found it incredibly helpful. I haven't looked at it myself. So, you know, what if you want to be able to talk about what's happening and express your feelings in the midst of it, and your parent doesn't want to? That can happen. That was true for me and both of my parents. With both of my parents, we weren't allowed to express grief. We had to hope for healing. We had to, their faith beliefs were really, you know, dictating a lot of this. And so we just weren't allowed. There was no permission for us to have these conversations about the truth that they were leaving, you know? So it was important that I and other people that I know, that we had and found other places where we could express what was happening for us and get support as needed. There may be unresolved issues at the end of life with a parent. And again, you may or may not get what you're seeking with them, and that's really hard. I think it's like essential that we name that for ourselves. We don't judge or shame it, and we just say, okay, I'm going to take care of this. I'm going to, in the ways that I can, I'm going to get the support that I need. We might be able to try bringing something up. We may recognize that we're looking for approval that we never received, or, you know, there may be unresolved conflict. And this can definitely intensify our emotional experience in this phase of the grieving process. Finally, here, self-care, healthcare practices. I did touch on this when I was talking about boundaries, but this is not the time to forego the habits that you know keep you strong and steady. Like seriously, I highly, highly recommend that you not be a martyr, that you not pour out everything and end up crumbling. It will not serve you. It won't serve you right now, and it won't serve you in the year, the days, the weeks, the months, and even the years to come. So it's that old oxygen mask idea. But I recommend that when we don't, maybe our executive function isn't at its highest, that we can just have like a sticky note reminding us of like 5 core habits that keep us steady. Then we can also look for, where can I lower the bar? Where can I simplify? Where can I outsource? How can I ask for help? So most the people that I work with are primarily women somewhere in the midlife season. And, that can be like 40s through early 70s. But one of the common things that I see, and certainly I recognize has been true for me as well, is that we're not necessarily good at asking for help. We're not great at giving ourselves permission to ask for or receive it. And this is not the time for that. Like, this is a great time to stretch ourselves beyond that old pattern because it won't serve us here. So acute grief is that season, so to speak, of the first days, weeks, and months following the death of your parent. This can be a time of a lot of work. Funeral memorial planning, notifying extended family and friends, closing accounts, paperwork, cleaning out a home. I mean, just tremendous amount of practical, sometimes exhausting work. We need our internal and external resources here like never before. So I just talked about that, those healthy habits that steady you. And here I would be asking, getting really clear, writing it down even, what are my internal resources? What are my external resources that I can rely on? So it could be like journaling, mindfulness, time in nature, my cat. It could be external resources like my walking partner, my grief circle, my therapist. But we need people, and we really need to respect that, again, like, we're human, having a human experience in a human body. We really need to take care of ourselves. We may begin to notice a type of grief called secondary loss in this time of acute grief. It will continue beyond, but secondary losses are, they're like layers on top of the primary grief or loss. So for instance, your kids have now lost their grandparent who they loved, or you're getting married and your dad is never going to meet your partner. It's things like that. It could be if you had a close relationship, it could be that you were having daily or weekly phone calls with that person, and now all of a sudden that's gone. It might be that you're used to, even though you're 55, you're still a kid and you still had your mama, and you were able to still rely on her when you were excited about something or sad about something. And all of a sudden you're like, ooh, I'm the adult now, These can all be examples of secondary losses. And these are really, really important to acknowledge for ourselves and each other if possible. Although if you're like me and, you've gone through a lot of loss, but most of your friend circle has not, it can feel hard because they can't get it, And I would say hook into a grief circle of people who do get it. This is a time of heightened or emotional intensity. So from wailing in the shower to feeling numb a lot of the time, we might experience this full gamut of human emotion. None of it's wrong or bad. All of it's normal. If we can try to just allow as much as possible, and I don't mean allow something to cause us harm, like, or cause somebody else harm, but just like, we can't control most of this. And especially in this acute grief phase, later on, I want to talk about this, but later on, we will have more of a sense of control in some aspects. But right now, it's just like, it's just happening. And if we can just sort of try to be with what's happening without panicking, chances are we'll be okay. That numbness is actually helpful. So sometimes people will come, a client will reach out a month after the death of their parents, say, and they were like, I'm actually really good, I'm doing great. And then all of a sudden, about a month later, just, no perfect timeline, they'll just say, now I'm not okay, right? And it's just because there was that beautiful protective numbness that helped them get through cleaning out the apartment and doing all of that practical hard work that had to be attended to. And all of a sudden that sort of numbness is thawing. I like to think of it a little bit as like these layers of armor, but it's not bad at all. It's like, we need some protection right now, even against the world. Like, life continues, right? So you may, if you've lost a parent, you may recognize something similar to this, like the first time you have to go to the grocery store after you've buried your parent. And everybody's laughing and talking and acting like nothing has happened. And you're like walking in a haze, thinking everything has shifted. Why can't you see it? That's like, we need a bit of heart protection in this phase. So, I will say this might be the time to get off of social media, especially when there's like Mother's Day, Father's Day, whether you had a positive, healthy relationship with your parent or not. Being offline when everybody else is sharing only the highlights of their life is wisdom. So I'm going to provide a handout that I actually think is really well written. And it includes like some common grief reactions in this acute grief phase. And it speaks to common feelings, physical sensation, behaviors. So some of the common feelings in this time could be sadness, anger, guilt, anxiety, loneliness, helplessness, shock, and more and more. We might experience, guilt again is one of those things that is very, very common. And I do think it's part of that protective mechanism because, as I said, it's like, it's easier for us to feel guilty than to feel helpless. So it's easier to feel angry than to allow ourselves to feel the depth of sadness or pain. We may notice relief in some cases. Maybe this was a very difficult human, or maybe watching the suffering was horrible and there's a sense of relief that it's over. And that is okay. We may have questions. Have we done enough? Were we there enough? We may wish that we had known how to do something differently, but we were always doing our best. Like, ask yourself, is this true? Because what I find to be true 99% of the time is we were always doing the best we could in that moment with the resourcing we had, etc. There's this experience that can happen that I really felt this after my dad died. And so what I see is that it could be that whoever our primary attachment was, so it could be, so I'll just say that whoever your primary attachment parent is, or it could be the last remaining family member or your last parent. but there's this sense of finality that can be experienced as almost like this seismic shift. So when my dad died, he this is just a story, it's really not helpful to you, but it's like but it's just my story. So he and my mom had been childhood sweethearts, and he died 11 years after her, and he asked to be cremated so that he had her grave opened up, and so he could be put there buried with her, which is just kind of like incredibly sweet and heartbreaking. But when he died, I remember driving through the town. It was the town of my childhood, and I had moved away at 17. But all of a sudden, there was a sense of, oh, like this part of my life is truly done. The family home is being sold. Like there's this finality, and it's just this weird kind of experience, but that can be its own separate grief as well. So that's something that you can just notice. And again, I've heard other people express their own version of that experience. So old wounds will likely rise to the surface, asking to be tended to. I touched on that. Whether that happens in this phase of acute grief or later on, it can actually be a beautiful part of our healing and becoming process as a human, I think. Now, if we don't have the resources that we need, and that includes social connection and social support, we may not be able to attend to that because we're just in survival mode, or we're just, but if we're doing our best to build community in healthy ways, and that doesn't mean we always have to have best friends. It just means we're hooked into healthy community in different shapes and forms. It could be your Al-Anon, it could be a grief circle, it could be a faith community, it could be one other sibling, it could be, like whatever, however we can do this, that creates it widens our capacity to be able to listen to and attend to those old wounds that are asking to be heard right now. Finally, here, I want to address that we may experience conflict in this time. So I mentioned that this is a time of heightened emotions. Most people probably, like in your circle, just honestly, do they have great coping skills? Do they have a whole lot of skill around communicating, or asserting boundaries in healthy ways, or self-regulating? Chances are, no, they do not. So noticing our own heightened emotional experience is helpful. Practicing compassion, a lot of compassion here for self and for other, because compassion is bi-directional, is essential right here. Practicing pausing between impulse and response, again, can be life-giving here. Not everything needs a response. Not everything needs a response by you. Not everything needs a response right now. Could you pause? Your sibling says something completely lacking and, empathy or whatever, pause. Take a break, walk away, honestly, this is one of the things that I would offer up as like one of my top 7 bits of life wisdom in general is pause between impulse and response. But here, like no other time would be ideal to practice this. So, we don't have 10 hours to talk about all the different forms of conflict that might arise when you bury a parent or when you lose a parent to death. But some of the things that do come up are, who's doing the work, who gets what of their belongings, do you have to keep all their stuff? Let's see, who's paying for stuff? Yeah, like the division of labor. all these different expectations, perceptions, and behaviors of other people that are out of your control. This is another time where, you know, where I started and I said, like, your parent is having, this is their story over there. The dying process is theirs. You are over here in your own storyline. This is yours. Your siblings are over there, you know, your mom's sister is over there. Everybody's having their own storyline, their own experience, and seeing the separation, feeling it in your body. Like for me as an HSP, I really, really feel people's energy. And I practice this all the time, like feeling the separation, reminding myself, like, what's mine and what's theirs, and not getting sucked into their drama or their, like, what I think of as a storyline. They are the main character in their story. You are the main character in yours. You take responsibility for this. So sibling jealousy and animosity might rise up for all sorts of reasons. If our parent remarried and that was a tricky dynamic, that can cause, you know, conflict. Like there's just so much stuff that can go on right now. You might love and respect a parent and also carry pain and unforgiveness. Doesn't mean they were perfect, right? And that can be hard. So I offer these ideas with no real solution here, except what I already said, heaps and heaps of compassion, pause between impulse and response, and also just know that this is likely to happen and you can resource yourself as much as possible to just prepare for this reality. Okay, the third and final section here, where I'm lumping together the two stages of grief: early grief, the first 2-ish years following the death of our parent, and mature grief, which is the rest of your life. A couple more forms of grief that I want to acknowledge here. Traumatic grief. That's where there is, like, if your parent died in a violent or traumatic way, you may be experiencing not only the core grief or loss, but also trauma. It can heighten, prolong the early grief stage and also the experience of grief in general, or the emotional experience and physical experience. So, you know, like if you are experiencing, like, this is hard, but if your parent died by suicide, then you may be dealing with traumatic grief, and you may have PTSD, or you may need, you know, trauma therapy on top of your grief circle. So delayed grief is grief that we don't feel in the moment or fully because it's either not safe to, or we're just in survival mode in that phase. So, you know, real life is messy. When my mom was dying of cancer, my husband got injured at his workplace and he lost his vision. And so I would have loved to be at my mom's bedside, but instead I was driving my husband back and forth to the nearest city where there was a hospital where the professionals could take care of him, because we had to focus on hopefully restoring his vision. He couldn't lift up the kids, like I had to do everything. Our youngest at the time was having seizures. Like, this, it's like a movie, but it's like, this is real life. And, you know, so that was all going on while she was dying. When my dad was dying, I was in severe chronic pain, waiting for a hip replacement and then recovering. I had 3 kids at that time. You know, like, it's just all the factors, right? It's like, my point is simply, like, life doesn't pause for us to attend to the the death of our parent. So there are times where we cannot grieve. We have to just survive. We have to get things done there, and so delayed grief, we might feel even kind of numb, and then or we may have this sense of like, I think I grieved, I'm not sure, or you weren't able to cry or express any emotion, and then there might be this time where all of a sudden it starts to come up. So this idea of waves of grief is actually really helpful. The length of time that it takes to adjust to a loss is different in each circumstance for each person. But what is true is that grieving often takes more time and is often harder than we think. So in my previous presentation, I believe I spoke to this, just like it really is this hard. Now, yeah, so it tends to come in waves. We might have this, we might even read this, hear this sometimes, but and I think it's helpful to hear another perspective, is that we may have this sense of things being a bit more linear, like, okay, I'll get through the first year, it'll get easier. I'll get through, whatever we come up with in our minds. And in fact, it's not so neat and tidy. We may actually feel this sort of natural, it's getting easier, and then we may have this wave of grief that comes unexpectedly. It fluctuates over time. There are a lot of triggers, triggers actually sounds negative. So in these phases of the first 2 years and then even beyond, we may notice that there are certain things that activate that grief or bring a fresh wave. It could be a scent, it could be a memory, it could be a special occasion, it could be that you're looking through old photographs, and that's normal. One thing that I recommend, though, is to just go ahead and be kind to yourself by marking down in the calendar the time leading up to significant dates, like especially death dates. At least for me, that's what is most for my parents. That's where I really would feel it. Even if my brain wasn't thinking of it, like I say, my mind wasn't conscious of this season, but my body would never forget. And all of a sudden I would start having this grief arise. And it was my husband who would say, Krista, look at the calendar, he was seeing the pattern before I was registering it. So I learned to be kind to myself and just track it, mark it on the calendar, and create a bit of extra spaciousness around it, so I could just attend to what was going to inevitably come up for me. And that's a perfect time, a natural healing way of feeling our feelings, remembering, processing. So you may notice it differently, but I do hear this with some of my friends who have lost children. And this has been my experience with my parents, and also with child loss, is that the weeks leading up to the date are hard. That's where there's this pain that comes up, this intensity of emotion. And then once I get through the day, I'm like, it lessens. But it is a great kindness to me I just build this into my life. I plan forward, I plan ahead for it. Over time, there are a couple final things. We're going to wrap up, but the couple last things that I want to talk about are creating safe containers to pull out our grief and sit with our grief, and then meaning making. Yeah, so I would say that this is immature grief, after the season or the time of early grief, that first 2 to 3 years, depending on, you know, the nature of that grief experience, when, you know, in those seasons, it's like we're less in control. The grief just comes. So we're in the grocery store. It's always at inopportune moments. It's never convenient. But then often it still might rise unbidden, but we might be able to, you know, like, let's say I'm working and I'm noticing these feelings rising up. Now in this, where I am, I can see it, I can hear it, and I can say, you know, just compassionately say, like, okay, I hear you. I'm going to make some space for you later today or tomorrow afternoon, you know, and I'm able to kind of tuck that away safely in this safe container. And what's important is that we don't just shove down, but we actually do make the space to go sit with the feelings that need to be processed. So there's this idea of, and if you've done trauma therapy, depending on the modality, your therapist may have supported you in that, in kind of imagining and creating this safe container for you. I do believe this gets easier with time. As we practice this, it does get easier. There is this inner sense of safety that we learn. Even when the big feelings arise, we learn, okay, I'm safe here. This pain, it hurts me physically, but I know I'm safe here. I know it's going to move again through my body. And finally, time-wise here, I need to wrap up, but meaning making, I'm just going to circle back though, because I want to anchor it into, like, why the heck am I talking about this? So task 4 of mourning, to find an enduring connection with our parent as we continue living forward. 6 needs of a grieving person. Number 6, to find meaning in time. Now, meaning making, this is a big conversation in and of itself, but it could be as simple as marking special or hard days, like I just said, you know. It could be honoring them by carrying forward the beautiful things that they model to us. And it can also be very intentionally doing our healing work to break old intergenerational patterns that we're like, yeah, I'm not carrying that forward. It could be recognizing how we were changed by the death experience, realizing the brevity and value of life, and using that as a springboard to maybe live more fully or allow ourselves to feel joy instead of waiting for life to be perfect. You know, so it can come in so many shapes and forms. It's very individual. Nobody should be telling you that you have to do this, because you don't. And often though, if we allow ourselves to move through the other stages and we don't judge or shame ourselves, we will naturally kind of find our way to some of this on its own. But we can do it also consciously. Like, it could be that we, you know, it helps us to just recognize our agency. And, you know, I'm like this, like, I'll delve into research around things to help me find my way forward. So for me, knowing that this is a healthy part of the process, I will actively look for, once I was out of the early grief, look for, how can I do this in a meaningful way? So I'm turning 53 right away. My mom died at 53. That has created fear in me. And what I'm doing in this season is, instead, I've decided to celebrate my 53rd year in a new way, and to celebrate my birthday month in a special way. I haven't yet come up with how I want to do that, but I've decided to commemorate and remember her and honor her in this way, as I also keep living forward. That's a really important part of it. All right, so in the beginning, you know, I said grief is messy. and life is messy. So one thing that, so two things, and I promise we're wrapping up here, is that learning from others is beautiful because we can glean from the wisdom and experiences of others, even though we still have to kind of bumble our way forward. So one thing I'd like to leave you with is just go gently. And the second thing is like what I consider to be an anthem in my life. It's a phrase I use all the time because it's been so meaningful for me. And it's simply, make peace with messiness to make space for joy. So thanks for being here with me. If you'd like to join the community, you can find us at sensitivecommunity.com to learn more about my work. You can come over to alifeinprogress.ca. And otherwise, thanks for being here with me.